Hello, and welcome back to Speak English Daily.
Hi, everyone. We are very happy to see you here today.
Hey everyone, I'm really glad you're here with us because we're diving into something that almost everyone deals with, but doesn't always know how to express in English. And that is what to say when you're feeling worn out, stretched thin, or just low on energy.
I'm happy you're here too because conversations like this are the ones that feel the most real and the most human. Nobody needs fancy vocabulary to describe happiness or excitement, but when people feel tired or overwhelmed, they often struggle to find the right words, especially if English isn't their first language, and that gets in the way of being understood.
Exactly. And if you're listening to improve your English, really pay attention to how we describe feelings today. Because this isn't textbook English. This is how people actually talk in daily life. And when you can describe how you feel with nuance, it opens the door to deeper, more natural conversations.
So grab a tea or coffee or whatever keeps you awake today, settle in for a bit, and listen not just to the words, but to the rhythm of how we talk about being tired. Because our goal here is that by the end of this episode, you'll feel more confident talking about your own energy levels, your stress, and your overload in English.
All right, now let's get into it. Because I've got to be honest, I've been waking up lately with this heavy fog in my head. Almost like my brain is still halfway in last night's dreams, while the rest of me is already thinking about my to-do list for the day. And before I even sit up, I already feel tired, which is unsettling because it makes me wonder how someone can sleep for hours and still not recharge.
Oh, I know that feeling. It's like your body technically did all the steps of sleeping, the closing your eyes part, the dreaming part, the waking up part, but somehow skipped the actual resting part. And then you spend the entire day trying to make up for the rest you never got.
And the thing is, fatigue isn't simple anymore. It isn't just about staying up late or not getting enough hours anymore. It's layered. There's physical tiredness, where your muscles and body feel heavy, and then there's emotional tiredness, where even small things feel like big things. And then there's that deep tiredness, where you're just carrying too much for too long without a break.
I had one of those days recently, around mid-afternoon, where I was staring at my laptop screen trying to finish something small, something I could normally wrap up in 20 minutes, but my eyes felt heavy. My brain kept drifting, and I caught myself rubbing my face like I was trying to manually reboot my system. And that's when I realized I wasn't just tired, I was drained.
That takes me right back to university, when I used to run from early classes to a shift at the cafe and then to evening courses. And by the time I got to my last lecture, the professor's voice felt like a lullaby from a parallel dimension, and staying awake in that room basically became an extreme sport for me.
I love how universal that experience is, because I used to sit in the back row with my notebook open, pretending to take thoughtful notes, but in reality, I was doing breathing exercises just to stay conscious, and my eyelids were doing their own little rebellion against me.
And what's funny is how hard we try to hide tiredness, especially in public or at work, as if admitting we're worn out makes us lazy or unproductive. So we plaster on polite smiles and keep up the act, all while mentally negotiating with ourselves to get through the next hour.
And then someone points it out, like, hey, you look tired, and suddenly you feel exposed, and you go, no, I'm fine, just thinking, while internally imagining yourself curled up on the floor with a pillow.
My favorite phrase people use in English is, "I'm running on empty," because it paints such a vivid picture of a fuel gauge barely hanging on in the red zone, and it communicates that you're not just sleepy, you're out of resources.
I also hear I'm drained and I'm wiped all the time. And both of those feel more accurate than just I'm tired, because they describe that full body shutdown where your energy is just gone.
For English learners, this is where things matter, because textbooks teach simple forms like I am tired, but real people rarely use the simplest form when it comes to feelings. We describe them, exaggerate them, make metaphors out of them, and that's what makes conversations sound natural.
And there's a difference between asking for sleep and asking for a pause. When people say, I need a quick break, it's not always about lying down. Sometimes it's about stepping outside, stretching, grabbing a drink, or just escaping for 5 minutes to reset the brain.
A friend of mine recently told me she schedules her rest into her calendar like it's an important meeting. And at first I laughed, but then I thought, wait, that makes sense. Because we don't treat rest as maintenance anymore. We treat it as an optional luxury. And that's how we end up exhausted without even realizing it.
If anything, that's why we need to talk about tiredness out loud. Not to complain, but to identify what we actually need. Because there's a big difference between needing sleep, needing a break, needing less pressure, or just needing someone to listen.
You know what's interesting? Lately, I've noticed that the kind of tired that gets me the most isn't the physical kind. It's the kind that happens in my head when I'm juggling too many responsibilities at once, and I haven't given myself permission to just slow down.
I relate to that so much, because mental stress sneaks up on you. Physical tiredness is loud and obvious. Your body aches, your eyes burn, you move slower. But mental tiredness builds quietly, in layers, until one day your brain feels like it's juggling 15 browser tabs that won't stop refreshing.
Exactly. And I catch myself saying things like, I've got so much going on right now, or I've got a lot on my plate, which is a very American way of describing that you're overwhelmed with tasks, expectations, or pressure, even if none of it is actually visible from the outside.
Yeah, that phrase is funny if you visualize it literally, like a buffet plate stacked with responsibilities, commitments, errands, deadlines, and unfinished decisions, all wobbling and threatening to fall off the edges at any moment, and you're trying to walk calmly with it through a crowded room.
What people from other countries tell me is that in their language, they don't have many soft or metaphorical ways to describe stress. Everything is blunt and direct. But in English, we tend to package stress inside imagery, humor, or understatement, which makes it feel a little less heavy to say out loud.
I also think people underestimate how often stress comes from the invisible stuff, like decision fatigue, social expectations, or the constant sense that you should be doing more, achieving more, and performing at your highest level every minute of the day, which is a ridiculous standard that nobody can actually sustain.
The funniest part is how we try to justify our stress instead of just accepting it. When a friend asks how we're doing, we'll say, oh, just busy, or I'm surviving, or I'm managing, which are all indirect ways of saying I'm stressed, but I don't want to dive into the chaos right now.
There's also that phrase, I'm juggling a lot right now. And it makes so much sense because stress often feels like juggling. It's about keeping things in the air without dropping anything. And the fear isn't just that you'll fail, it's that you'll disappoint people or lose control of something that matters to you.
What really surprised me once was realizing how different cultures respond to someone admitting they're stressed. In some places, people immediately jump into problem-solving mode, offering advice and strategies, while in others, people show empathy first, sometimes without offering any solutions. They just say things like, wow, that sounds hard, or do you want to talk about it?
I saw that when I lived abroad for a while, and I remember how strange it felt that admitting stress didn't make anyone look down on you. It just made you human. And I thought, why don't we treat ourselves the same way instead of pretending we're always fine?
And then there's burnout, which is like stress that's been ignored for too long. It's not just feeling tired, it's the complete lack of motivation or interest, even in things you used to enjoy. And that's when you know you're beyond normal stress and into something deeper.
And once you hit that stage, little decisions feel huge. Simple tasks feel complicated, and you end up staring at your to-do list wondering how anyone expects you to function when your brain feels like someone poured concrete inside it.
The phrase, "my brain is fried," shows up a lot in English, and I love it because it captures that exact moment when you've been processing too much information for too long and you can't absorb anything else, like a computer running out of memory and freezing.
What makes this all even more complicated is how we carry our stress into every part of our day without noticing. You bring it into conversations, into the way you breathe, into how quickly you answer messages, into how you react to tiny inconveniences. And at some point, you realize you've been operating in survival mode without ever stopping to ask why. And I think the moment you can name what kind of tired or stressed you are, you regain a little control, even if nothing changes instantly. Because being able to say, "I'm overwhelmed," or "I'm under a lot of pressure," or "I'm juggling too much right now," helps you feel seen, even if you're just saying it to yourself.
There's a point where tiredness turns into something heavier, something that doesn't just live in your muscles or your eyelids, but settles somewhere in your chest. And that's when people usually say, "I feel overwhelmed," because it's no longer about being sleepy, it's about feeling like everything keeps piling up faster than you can sort through it.
I've had weeks like that where nothing catastrophic happens, but the small things keep stacking. Emails, appointments, family things, personal goals, unexpected tasks. And individually, they're all manageable, but together they form this mountain of obligations that you keep trying to climb without proper gear.
What makes overwhelm so complicated is that it doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it just looks like someone staring at their phone for too long, or sitting quietly in the kitchen with their coffee going cold, or avoiding a task they could finish in 10 minutes because their brain can't deal with one more demand.
I once read that overwhelm doesn't always show itself through chaos. Sometimes it shows through paralysis, like you freeze not because you don't care, but because you care too much and you don't know where to start. So everything stays undone and the guilt quietly builds on top of the original stress.
That hits home because I used to think overwhelmed people were always scrambling or panicking or crying in bathrooms. But then I realized my way of being overwhelmed was pretending everything was fine and then sitting in silence while my stomach twisted itself into knots.
And here's the thing, overwhelm often comes with this strange shame, like you're embarrassed for struggling with things other people seem to handle easily. So you minimize your own feelings, tell yourself you're overreacting, and try to push through it instead of asking for help or slowing down.
For English learners, I always highlight that overwhelmed is a really versatile word. It's emotional, it's mental, and it's situational. And it doesn't necessarily mean someone is falling apart, it just means they've reached capacity, like a cup that's full to the brim and can't handle another drop.
And when the cup overflows, that's when people start using the word burned out, which carries more weight because burnout isn't temporary. It develops over time, especially when someone keeps pushing without rest, without support, or without feeling like what they're doing matters.
I had a friend who realized she was burned out when she stopped feeling excited about things she normally loved, and she told me that was the scariest part, not the exhaustion, but the absence of joy, like someone dimmed the lights in her world and she didn't know how to turn them back on.
I get that more than I used to, because burnout isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and numb, like you're living your life on low volume, going through the motions without connecting to anything deeply. And that's when people start saying things like, "I'm running out of steam," or "I'm hitting a wall," or "I've reached my limit."
The funny part is how much English relies on metaphors for this stuff, because we don't usually say, I am emotionally overwhelmed due to cumulative stress. We say, I'm drowning in work, or everything is piling up, or I need to reset. And those phrases tell a story without having to explain every detail.
But there's also softness in how people support each other when they notice someone's overwhelmed. They offer these gentle openings like, do you want to talk about it? Or, can I help with something? Or, what do you need right now? And those questions don't demand solutions, they just make space. And it's interesting how simply admitting, I'm overwhelmed, can shift the entire dynamic of a day. Because once you say it out loud, it stops living secretly in your head, and you're no longer pretending to carry everything alone.
What I've noticed is that when someone finally reaches that point where they feel overwhelmed or burned out or just stretched too thin, the conversation starts to shift from describing the problem to trying to figure out how to deal with it. And that's where you start hearing people use language about coping, recharging, unplugging, taking breathers, or needing to step away from everything for a little while.
And the funny thing is that coping doesn't usually look heroic or dramatic. It's rarely someone boarding a flight to Bali to find themselves or disappearing into the mountains for a 6-month silent retreat. Most coping happens in tiny, boring human ways, like sitting in a parked car for 10 extra minutes before going inside, or taking a long shower at night because it's the only place where nobody asks for anything from you.
Yes, and in English conversations, you hear these really soft expressions that don't sound like solutions, but they're actually survival in disguise, like, I'm taking a breather, or I need to unplug for a bit, or I'm trying to slow down this week. And what they're really saying is, my brain is struggling and I'm trying to give it some air.
My personal favorite is, I'm trying to recharge, because it treats energy as something that can be refilled, like a battery, and it acknowledges that you're not broken, you're just empty, which feels kinder and more realistic than pretending you should be able to operate at full power all the time.
I also think coping has a social side because people handle tiredness differently depending on whether they have someone to talk to. Some people cope by venting to a friend over coffee or voice messages. Some cope by shutting down and avoiding everyone. And others cope by turning into comedians, cracking jokes about their exhaustion because humor makes the weight feel a little less heavy.
Right, and then there are the people who cope by planning. They go into organizational mode, making to-do lists, writing things out, scheduling breaks, meal prepping, color-coding calendars. And on the surface, it looks like productivity, but underneath, it's just a strategy to keep from drowning in chaos.
You also see a shift in self-talk when someone is coping. Instead of saying, I need to survive today, they start saying things like, I'm taking it one thing at a time, or I'm focusing on what I can control, or I'm trying not to overload myself. And those are softer, gentler ways of approaching stress without bullying themselves.
And English uses a lot of conditional language there, like, I might take a day off, or I think I need a break. Or maybe I'll slow down this weekend, which shows how people often feel guilty about needing rest, so they phrase it like a suggestion instead of a decision.
What surprises English learners is how often coping involves doing less, not doing more. Like someone will say, I cleared my weekend, or I canceled a plan, or I stayed offline for a bit. Because sometimes the best way to handle stress isn't adding new activities like yoga or journaling or hiking, it's removing the constant noise around you.
And then there's the social permission aspect, where someone close to you says it's okay to pause, or it's okay to rest, or you don't have to handle everything today. And those words are powerful because most of us never give ourselves that grace unless someone else offers it first.
I remember once when I was buried in deadlines and everything felt heavy, and a friend casually said, hey, you can just do that tomorrow and nothing will explode. And for some reason, that sentence hit me harder than a motivational speech because it reminded me that life isn't a ticking time bomb.
And I think it's interesting how coping language is often about creating space, like I'm stepping back, or I'm laying low, or I need to reset. And all those phrases imply that rest isn't quitting, it's maintenance. And you come back after with more clarity and more energy. The truth is, talking about how we cope with stress or tiredness makes us feel less alone in it. And when we share those little survival strategies, even the silly ones, it reminds us that nobody is built to be a machine, and that it's okay to step back, slow down, or refill the tank before moving again.
One thing I find fascinating is how English uses layers to describe tiredness and stress, almost like there are different levels of emotional volume, and people choose the level that matches how vulnerable they feel comfortable being in that moment, whether they want to keep things light or whether they're ready to open up more honestly.
Right, because when people don't want to reveal much, they tend to stick to lighter phrases like, I'm tired, or I'm a bit worn out, or I've had a long day. And those sentences function almost like polite shields, saying just enough without inviting too many questions or too much concern.
But when someone trusts the person they're talking to, the language gets more specific and more emotional, and you start hearing things like, I'm overwhelmed, or I'm under a lot of pressure right now, or I feel stretched too thin, which all give the listener a clearer picture of what's actually going on beneath the surface.
And then there are the intensifiers people bring in when the feeling is heavy or dramatic. Phrases like, I'm exhausted, or I'm completely drained lately, or my brain is fried, or I'm at my limit. And all of those carry more urgency, like a quiet alarm bell telling the listener that this isn't just about being sleepy, it's about being overloaded.
English also has these playful metaphors that soften the tone, making heavy feelings easier to talk about, like I'm running on fumes, or I need to hit reset, or I'm operating at 10% battery. And those phrases are brilliant because they communicate vulnerability without making the conversation feel too heavy or uncomfortable right away.
That's especially useful in workplaces or with acquaintances, where emotional honesty isn't always socially rewarded. So metaphors become this polite middle ground, letting you complain without actually sounding like you're complaining. And that fits well with the cultural expectation to stay composed, even when you're falling apart a little on the inside.
Another thing English does is soften statements with these little modifiers like kind of, a bit, pretty, or sort of. So instead of saying, I'm stressed, you hear people say, I'm kind of stressed, or I'm a bit overwhelmed, or I'm pretty wiped. And those tiny words act like cushions, signaling vulnerability, but not too aggressively.
The opposite also exists, though, especially when someone wants to emphasize intensity, using words like totally, completely, really, super, or absolutely. So you hear things like, I'm totally wiped, or I'm completely out of energy lately, or I'm really burned out lately. And all of those push the volume up so the listener understands that the feeling isn't mild, it's about being overloaded.
What I love is how people check in with each other in these situations, using questions that aren't too direct, like, how are you holding up? Or, how's everything going? Or, do you need anything? And those questions carry emotional weight because they acknowledge the struggle without demanding a detailed explanation.
And when people want to offer support, they usually don't jump into advice right away. Instead, they say things like, I'm here if you want to talk, or tell me what you need, or take your time, or go get some rest. Because emotional support isn't always about fixing the problem. Sometimes it's about creating permission for someone to slow down.
I wish more English learners understood how powerful these softer forms are, because they make conversations feel authentic and humane, and they let you express stress or exhaustion without sounding like you're reading a medical report or complaining endlessly, and that's what makes language feel alive.
And honestly, once you learn how to describe your inner world with nuance, it changes how you relate to other people too, because you stop hiding behind simple words like tired, and you start naming the deeper truth, whether it's pressure or burnout or overwhelm or the need to reset. And that's when conversations stop being surface level and start becoming real.
What I've been thinking about lately is how tiredness and stress don't happen in isolation. They bleed into the rest of our lives, affecting how we talk to the people we care about, how we show up in relationships, how patient or impatient we are, and even how much we feel like ourselves. Because when you're deeply tired, you don't just lose energy, you lose access to the gentler parts of your personality.
I've noticed that too, especially in relationships where one person is carrying a heavy load, because the tiredness doesn't always come out as sadness or vulnerability. Sometimes it comes out as irritability or silence or avoidance, and the other person has to learn how to read those signals without taking them personally.
There's a phrase in English where someone says, "I don't have the bandwidth right now," and it basically means their mental or emotional capacity is full. So even if they care about you and want to be present, they can't absorb any more input. And I think that's such a useful phrase because it translates the invisible into something people can understand.
And even at work, bandwidth becomes a polite way to say I'm overloaded or I can't take on more tasks without crashing. And it protects people from sounding dramatic or uncooperative, because nobody wants to admit they're drowning in spreadsheets or projects or emails, even if that's the truth.
What amazes me is how many misunderstandings are rooted in unspoken exhaustion. Couples argue not because they actually disagree on something important, but because both of them are stretched thin, and neither one wants to be the first to admit they're tired. So they end up fighting about dishes or schedules or tone of voice, when the real issue is just depletion.
And then there's the social side, where stress affects how much we feel like participating in the world. Invitations become obligations, phone calls feel demanding, even messages feel like one more thing requiring a response. And so people withdraw not because they don't care, but because their energy can't stretch far enough to maintain every relationship at once.
I've had that moment where a friend sends a text asking how I've been, and I genuinely want to answer, but I stare at my phone for 3 hours because I don't have the energy to compose a thoughtful reply. And then I feel guilty because silence can be misunderstood even when it's not meant to hurt anyone.
And guilt is a strange companion to stress because it amplifies the feeling of carrying too much. So not only are you overwhelmed, but you feel responsible for letting people down, even when those people would probably understand if you just said, "Hey, I'm at capacity right now. Give me a minute to come back to you."
When you look at it that way, one of the most compassionate things we can do is give each other room to be tired, to pause, to not perform. And that includes the language we use, because supportive language often sounds like "take your time," or "no pressure," or "rest first, we can talk later." And those sentences give people permission to be human without apologizing for it.
It's interesting how identity gets tied into productivity too, because a lot of people only feel valuable when they're producing or helping or being useful. So when they're tired, they don't just feel low energy, they feel worthless, and that makes it harder to admit they need a break, especially in cultures that treat rest as laziness instead of maintenance.
That's why when someone says, "I need space," or "I need time to recharge," or "I'm trying to get my energy back," it's not selfishness, it's honesty. And it shows they know themselves well enough to recognize when continuing would do more harm than good.
And it's funny how perspective changes once you've burned out before, because after you've hit that wall at least once, you can spot the warning signs earlier. The irritability, the foggy thinking, the shrinking enthusiasm, the frustration with small tasks, and suddenly taking a breather stops feeling like indulgence and starts feeling like survival. At the end of the day, the ability to say, I'm tired, or I'm overwhelmed, or I need space with clarity and without guilt might be one of the most important communication skills adults can learn because it keeps relationships healthy, expectations realistic, and people connected even through the messy parts of being human.
When I think about everything we've unpacked today, it hits me how universal all of this really is. Because tiredness, stress, and overwhelm aren't just private struggles. They're part of the human condition, yet most of us walk around convinced we're the only ones running low, while everybody else seems to be gliding through life with infinite reserves of energy and enthusiasm.
It's interesting how adults learn to mask exhaustion so well that sometimes even close friends don't notice, and we treat fatigue like a personal weakness instead of a sign that our system has been running at full capacity for too long, which is ironic considering how many people are silently experiencing the same thing.
And when people finally talk about it, there's almost always this sigh of relief, because naming the feeling transforms it from a vague shadow into something manageable, and language becomes a tool for connection. When someone says, I'm overwhelmed, or I'm drained, or I'm burnt out, they're opening a small window into their inner world.
I think we tend to forget that rest is not a reward for productivity. It's a basic requirement for functioning. But so many of us grew up with the mindset that we have to earn rest by completing tasks, finishing projects, or proving our worth. And that's how we end up collapsing instead of pausing.
And the thing is, the moment we understand our own capacity, we also become more compassionate toward others, because stress changes how people behave. It affects our tone, our patience, our communication, and our availability. And once you realize that, it becomes easier to interpret someone's short answers or silence without assuming the worst.
It's similar with relationships. Friends, partners, families, where a lot of conflict doesn't come from not caring, it comes from being stretched too thin. And the simple act of saying, I don't have the bandwidth right now, or I need a bit of space, can prevent misunderstandings that might otherwise escalate into unnecessary arguments.
For English learners especially, this is where language goes beyond vocabulary and grammar. Learning how to talk about your internal life is what turns small talk into conversation, and conversation into connection, because it lets people know how to meet you where you are instead of guessing.
And honestly, one of the kindest things someone can say is, take your time, or get some rest, or no rush, because those phrases relieve the invisible pressure we constantly put on ourselves, especially in a world that acts like rest is optional instead of part of staying alive.
If anything, I hope this episode encourages people to pay attention to those subtle signals, the foggy thinking, the shrinking patience, the lack of excitement about things that once mattered, the feeling of running on fumes, and to respond to those signals before everything crashes, rather than after.
And I hope it encourages people to check in with the ones they care about too, because sometimes a simple, how are you holding up? Or, do you need a breather? Or, tell me what's going on, can convince someone they don't have to carry everything alone. And that matters more than most of us realize.
All right, I think that's a good place to wrap up today's episode. Thank you for spending time with us and for practicing real English that goes beyond surface-level phrases, because learning how to express your inner life in another language is a brave and meaningful thing.
And thank you for listening, for being part of these conversations, and for showing up even on days when your battery might be low. Take care of yourselves. Rest when you can. Give yourself permission to pause, and we'll see you in the next episode.